Hi everybody, welcome. Really happy to continue these marriage dialogues, even just for me to have this special time together with you all, and especially an opportunity to share things that will inspire you to reach new heights in your marriage, especially during these 9 days where we're all trying to get to that better place in everything that we do. So today's Tanya actually really inspired me, and as I was reading it, I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is how I felt like all the days of my life in my marriage. And I hope when you read this with me, that you will too. I have become small. This is what Abraham felt like and toward Hashem all the time and all the favors. Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, all of the greatest of greats, no matter how much Hashem gave them blessings, they felt small. They felt, what other, miracle is God going to do in my way? I can't rely on miracles. He's given me so much. And Yaakov actually, felt very small, and that's why he really prayed for, for the miracles, because he felt like God did so much for me. How can I even ask for more? And in regards to Ishmael, it says that how much more blessings he got, the more he became arrogant, the more he grew very haughty because of the blessings God gave him. So when I was reading this, I just had this sense like, oh my goodness, this is how I felt. Like from the beginning of our meeting till 33 years later, you have provided me with so much. You've given me so much of the leeway of being able to do what I wanted to do. And the more you gave me free reins, the more I felt so blessed, the more I felt small. I felt, how can I even ask for one more thing? And I think if we women take upon ourselves to feel more and more humble for the fact that our husbands do what they do and provide us with what they provide us, I feel that has made me a better person. Sometimes you learn, the bread of shame, you feel so shamed because you got something for free. And yes, each of the partners do their part. But if we can just learn from Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov how to feel humble before the other for all the things they do, definitely the husband too, for all the work the woman does for caring for, whether it's the house or the baby, and maybe even doing her part to bring parnasa and in the home. I think this is a real key ingredient, of really appreciating what great life you have because the other is doing their part. And even if sometimes this evil inclination kind of creeps in and kind of makes you feel he's not doing his part, but as David HaMelech teaches us, he even honored his enemies for having taught them one or two halachas, and forever he honored them and treated them with respect. So we can all find at least one or two things that because of our spouse, we have such a better life, such an easier life. And I really wanted to take this opportunity publicly to tell you that's exactly how I was feeling when I was reading this, and I was thinking about our relationship and everything that you have provided for me to do what I have been able to do.
Well, thank you. Anyone who listened to our inaugural podcast last week, where we talked about the divine flow from the level of Keter Ateres, from the Pasuk Ateres Baila, Eshes Chayil Ateres Baila, the flow through the husband who's bit on Facebook.
Oh, here we go. Okay, yeah. Okay.
So that the husband is bittul to the wife, and the flow goes back up and it's elevated. I'm not going to go back through all of that. But the point that my wife is making about her appreciation in the context of the language of katnus, feeling small, of course, the husband and I in particular feel with the reflective light back through my wife and to me. So the feeling's certainly mutual. We had some questions posted on the Facebook, as I understand that I'm not a Facebook user, but someone told me that we had some questions, and I wanted to address them because I thought they were good questions, but they were relatively easily addressed if you keep in mind what we were talking about. The divine flow, the mystical flow of divinity of the finite, infinite world into the finite world is described in metaphorical terms. If you learn the Tanya, if you learn Hasidus, the Lashon, when speaking of the spheres and the Or, the light, and the Kalim, the worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, and even the Koiches, the powers, the Midos, Chesed, Gevur, Tiferes, starting with Chochmah, Bina, Tiferes, Chesed, Gevura, Chochmah, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gevur, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. You often see the language Kivyochel, as it were, which is an English expression which indicates that we're talking about matters that transcend the physical world. But the Torah speaks in the language of man, as it says, and we have to use language which is a language built upon our experience of Gashmius. So one of the questions asked was, can you have this divine flow and this elevation in a relationship if you don't have children? Because we talked about the divine flow that flowed down from the level of Keser, the crown, into the husband of Chochmah, through the woman of Bina, into Da'as, and the Toldos of the children. And then the light goes back from the children to the wife, Bina, husband, Chochmah, and back Lamayla. And the answer to that is, of course you can. A husband and wife can experience that flow in the same way that an individual can experience that entire flow. Within, we say that an Adam is an oilam cotton, a man or woman. When we say man in this context, we mean man writ large, as an example of humanity, is a small world. And so when we talk about the divine flow of Chochmah and Bina, the male, the female, the Toldos, the children, and how it flows, that exists within each and every one of us. We have the Zohar side, the Chochmah, the Bina. No one is simply Chochmah or simply Bina. In my wife's series on Reaching New Heights, in the marriage book and the prayer book, she discusses this at great length. She has a wonderful children's book on camping and the elements, the 4 elements of Doimim, earth, Semach, organic matter, Chaya, which is sentient beings, and Medaber, which are humans, that actually I confused the 4 elements. The 4 elements being Doime, earth, and fire, Esh, Ruach, wind, and
water.
Mayim, water. And that each of us contain all of these elements, but in what degrees and in what emphasis it's different. So that a person alone can experience that divine flow by exercising their chokhmah and having their bina, their understanding, their analytical mind being bittul to that divine flow through wisdom, the koach ma. And once receiving that koach ma, analyzing it rationally, logically, understanding it, breaking it apart, rebuilding it, and then creating, as it were, an engineering blueprint, das. And that will result in toldos, children within yourself, children which are new and experience the world differently because of that divine flow. So the simple answer to the question, do you have to have children? No, you don't even have to be married. If you understand the Hasidic articulation of the Kabbalistic terms, you know that you can live your life within that world. Now, is it heightened when you find your beshert? Absolutely. Is it heightened as a zug, as a couple, when you have actual children? 100%. Is it heightened when your children have grandchildren and you have einiklach? Yes. But it doesn't mean that you can't experience it. So going from that, what I thought we would talk about to at least kind of start the new subject matter, I wanted to come back to one other question. The other question was, while it's easy to, this was how it was articulated as I recall, while it's easy to be bittul to the Eibishter, to God, it's hard to be bittul to another person, especially like your husband or your wife, whatever it may be. And I think that's just the individual's perspective, because I can point to many, many people, myself included at times, where it's easier to be bittul to a human person or a human system or human institution than it is to the Eibishter. So for example, I'm never going to cheat on my taxes. Just not going to happen. As a lawyer, I'm not going to do anything that's going to put my law license or my freedom at risk. So I'm not going to cheat on my taxes. I'm not going to break the law, at least not knowingly. And I'm going to be totally obedient to the secular law. I might protest it. I might vote against it, but I'll do everything perfectly according to law. However, there are many times when I fall short in terms of being bittul to the Eibishter and to the law that he has given us. I'm not perfect. I've fallen short. So it's easier for me to be bittul to the human system, which is nothing more than a bunch of humans crafting laws, sometimes than it is to the Eibishter. Now granted, it can be a lot simpler to be obedient and bittul, self-abnegation, nullified to the truth of God, than it is to put up with the arrogance, the hypocrisy, the stupidity of humans. And so that's what I think this individual was articulating, but it's not necessarily the case that it's either or. There will be times when one is easier than the other. What we try to do in the Hasidic world is always keep at the forefront the fact that the Eibishter's truth, God's truth, is the truth. It's not one of many truths. It is the only truth. Everything else is an approximation, less or more. But there is only one truth. And if you understand that notion, that that's the true or, the light, whether it's a panimistic light, an inward light, a light that is mimale, that fills you up, or a chitzoniistic light, an external light, a light that's soiviv, that surrounds you, that's the only true truth. So I thought, having answered those questions in terms of the new subject, that
I'd like to just say something regarding that, because I think when you're dealing face to face with a person, it could kind of push your buttons more easily, and it could be way harder for you to submit yourself and humble yourself before another person. Whereas, God is so far away, and so it could be in some respects easier because you're not dealing with it so in person, as it were. But I think that's where she was coming from. And I think most people, as a counselor, when they come to me and are are dealing with such difficulties in their relationship is because they have to in and out, day and night, deal with this person and their weakness. And so that's why it could be a little harder for them. And it's very common, very common. And people don't even think that. They think, they may have married the wrong person, or they may have chose poorly, or made a mistake, or they can't believe, where did all this relationship go wrong when it was so good in the beginning that they chose to really dedicate their life to each other. So it's very shocking when people see this. And as I've stated in my marriage book, God purposely designed that they see the best of one another. God purposely gave the higher powers of their soul to relate to one another in such a godly and magnificent and almost magical way. And after they get married, he takes that away. And so then they're interacting on a lower level, meaning their lower parts of their souls are now interacting with one another. And so it can become very difficult, in contrast to how beautiful it all was in the beginning. And most people don't know that that's God's design, to then have them work on their own being, to refine themselves, to elevate themselves. And once they do that, then they have the powers to access their higher powers of their souls that they had when they were dating, so that then they could see more of the good of the other. Because that higher power of the soul that they were gifted with, and then it was taken away, is the power of wisdom to see the good in the other. So God purposely takes that away, and you purposely then see not the good in the other so readily and so easily. And so you have to really work at refining and humbling yourself, so that you can then make space for this extraterrestrial wisdom that he gave you in the beginning. And now, with time and with hard work and with patience and reaching that level of humbleness, creating that space, you can then be gifted again with this higher intellectual power, which then helps you relate to the other, and God will give you the vision. So don't think in the beginning when you're going through this that it's like, why me? And what went wrong? It was designed by perfect design, God's perfect design, even though we can't kind of wrap our heads around it.
So I want to leverage that, because I think that's an important point. That I've had the distinct privilege to be married to this woman, and so when she came out with her book Reaching New Heights on marriage, it became for me a kind of written memorialization or confirmation of how my wife lives her life and taught me how to live a life as her other half. And so it can be difficult to, when you're in a difficult relationship, to listen and read about these concepts, what my wife just spoke about and what we'll speak about a little bit later, in terms of her advice on marriage, because you're enmeshed in the quarrelsomeness of it all and the gashmidicness of it all. And so you don't see all this spiritual stuff. You don't see the higher levels, the mystical divine flows. And I've oftentimes heard people say to my wife, that's all well and good, but it's day to day. It's a battle day to day. How do I get through the day? And so, insofar as it is the 9 days, I thought it appropriate to explain a concept that Ebba talks about. I brought the Sefer here. I'm not going to go through the Sikha, but the Sikha is in Shabbos Chazon, and it's in Likutei Sichas Chelik Chavtes, 29th volume, and it's on pages 18 to 25. It's a Yiddish Sikha, but it's been translated into Hebrew, I'm pretty certain. What the Sikha talks about is the famous story that comes out of the Haftorah, and Yeshayahu uses the language Chazon, and this Haftorah, and the Shabbos itself is considered Shabbos Chazon, the Shabbos right before Tisha B'Av, sometimes even on Tisha B'Av, when Tisha B'Av is Nidcha, is pushed off to Sunday, when Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos. This year, Tisha B'Av falls out Motzi Shabbos Sunday, and so Shabbos Erev Tisha B'Av is Shabbos Chazon. We read this Haftorah, the last of the Haftorahs of Onusa, of the afflictions that befall us as a result of Galus. And so my wife is doing something technical here. Okay, we need to mute somebody. Well, we can't, because I think that's one of the leaders. So someone has an iPhone is just got some background noise. We'll get over it. So on Shabbos Chazon, the Haftorah of Yeshayahu, which has the Lashon Chazon, Hillel Miparich, known as the Paricher, the Chassid, explains that this vision is the opportunity for us to see the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi, the final Beis HaMikdash of Geula. And even though one might not physically see it, one's higher level neshama sees it. And Reb Hillel brings this out from a teaching of the Bedichever Rebbe, and not the Bedichever Rebbe, the Parashat. Yeah, the Bedichever Rebbe, Magid Bedichev, and the Bedichever teaches, if we can ask everyone who's on just to mute their Zoom calls.
Can you text this person and have her make us host? Do you know how to do chat?
I don't know how to do that, so.
I just can't see Gemma.
She's a host, so she's
I know,
gonna.
she has to.
Yeah.
Can you know how to chat? Put it on the chat.
1 second, so we're gonna try to chat. Please mute. Let's see if that works. Yes, it worked. Okay, very good. So the Bedichever teaches that the language Chazon from Marin to see is son a very fancy suit. And the son loves the suit and he doesn't want to take it off. He goes out and plays and he destroys it. Comes in, his father sees him, he's a little disturbed. And he tells him, you've got to treat your clothes better. And he has him tailored a new suit. And the son does the same thing again. And when he comes in this time, the father doesn't give him the suit. He tailors a new, even nicer suit. And he puts it away. And once a year, he brings it out and shows his young son. And shows him what is possible if he just grows with the maturity and the discipline to be deserving of it. And of course, the mashal is of the Eibishter, the father, and the young child, the Jewish people. And the first suit is the first Beis HaMikdash, the second suit is the second Beis HaMikdash, and the third suit is the vision of the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi. And it's important that the father show the young child the suit every now and then, otherwise the young child's just going to forget about it. Okay, he enjoyed the first two suits and he loved them, but after a while, as children are wont to do, out of sight, out of mind. So once a year, the young child gets to actually see it. So one of the questions that Rebbe raises is, that's fine for the tzaddikim. They live in the world of Atzilus. They see the suit. They know what it is. They live in Geula. But what about the rest of us who live in a Gashmadika world, in a Gashmadika body, physical world, a physical body? We don't see it. Shabbos will come and go, and I won't see the Beis HaMikdash Shlishi. I'll read about the Haftorah. I'll be told of the Mashal. I'll be reminded at the Farbrengen. But it'll be another year that I don't actually see the Beis HaMikdash Shlishi, b'basar einayim, with my physical eye. What the Rebbe explains is that, taking from Bereshis Rabbah, the famous pasuk, Kol Esav ve'esav she'ein lo mazel. There's not a blade of grass. There's nothing in the physical world that doesn't have a mazel. And the mazel strikes it and says, grow. And a blade of grass grows. And what that represents is the idea, the mazel in the simplest form, are the physical heavens, the constellations, the physical laws of nature. That everything in the physical world is driven, is organized, is moved from God through nature. But at a higher Kabbalistic and Hasidic understanding, what this means is that the divine flow that occurs Lamaila, in transcendence, in the heavens, a place that is not a place, a thing that's not a thing, can't be described in our language other than through these metaphors, that it flows into this world and says, Gedal, grow, move, act, believe. It directs us. It is the truth. Whether we experience it with our five senses or our intellect or even our sense of faith, it is there. And what the Haftorah does for us is to allow us, even if but for a moment during the Haftorah or during the Farbrengen, when we're saying L'chaim and Farbrengen and meditating and singing a niggin, that those moments of experience, what we call the experience of being, allows us to tap into that vision. And don't expect to literally see it in your mind's eye. Expect to experience it. And that comes back to teach us what I started with, which is, you might read my wife's marriage book and think it's a wonderful book, but it just isn't shaykh to me. It doesn't apply to me. I'm living in a, God forbid, Rahman Litzwan, an awful relationship. Lo aleinu, it shouldn't occur to anyone. And it's daily. It's a battle every day. I've got this problem, that problem. Or even not even a relationship. I just have problems at work, here, there. How do I deal with it? How do I win the lottery, the physical lottery, to get out from this thing? And the answer is not in the physical world. We have to do what we have to do. There's no question. Create the keli. The answer is going to come through this flow. And you have to open yourself up to experience that through your sense of faith, your sense of trust in God, that it is the truth. And if you simply move the doubts, the physical doubts, because that's what those are, emotions in the physical world, these are all physical doubts. If you can simply remove yourself from those, then you have the opportunity to experience that, even if it's momentary. But even that rega, even that moment of experience, will open up enormous avenues of opportunity.
Well, definitely the flow, as we learn in the Torah, when husband and wife learn Torah together, they bring down this fiery, powerful flow of miracles that will not only meld the two neshamas together, as we were saying, the woman has certain qualities that the man has, and the man has certain qualities that the woman doesn't. And when they bring down this flow, whether they're intimate together, whether they're celebrating Shabbos together, whatever mitzvahs and occupying time and space as one soul, this divine flow comes in and does its mystical repair, and the two souls become infused in one another, where each one will gain from the others, powerful dimensions and their special qualities. We also learn that this flow of divine energy actually eradicates like a fire and purifies and takes away the impurities of the other. So engaging in the physical world together in this way, and especially in that humble way, then they draw forth even more flow and even more miraculous salvation from Hashem when done in this way. And we learn in one of the haftorahs, like the whole purpose of our learning Torah and our praying and all the mitzvahs is to be able to get to that humble state. That's the reason for our being. And yes, our spouse, our children are likened to milk in a vase that is cracked, that you can't really see the cracks, but for the milk that shows where those little cracks are, so that we can work on ourselves and see how, well, I guess I'm not humble. I'm kind of aggressively arguing, or I can see I'm not humble because I'm really annoyed and irritated, and I'm pushed to like feel this way. That's the indication that God wants us to experience by the other people, so that we can see our weaknesses, we can work on refining ourselves to accept with love and compassion the other with their imperfections, and then we create the open space for this flow, for this divine fire, and the divine fire does the work.
So I want to bring up, I was going to talk about something else, but I'll push that off a little bit till later in this podcast, or maybe next week. One area in which what my wife has just described, that I think is one of those keys to a relationship, and to any relationship, whether it's husband and wife, or you with your friends or your colleagues at work. And my wife articulates it in the marriage book. There's a Hasidic story, and there's a Hasidic taich on the famous blessing given by Bilam when he was hired by Balak to curse the Jews. The famous story, well, I'll let my wife bring over the famous story. Well, one second. We have Mendel Fudafast and the cards, and Matovu Alecha. But I want to get to the key. The key of these two things, these two expressions, is that all too often when we look at the other person, we see all of their faults and all of the things that they do that annoy us. That's quite natural. Why? Because we're focused on how we feel, what's good for us. But what we don't recognize, and this is key, is that in not looking at our own faults and not really understanding how we have fallen short, and indeed maybe because we don't want to look at ourselves honestly, we're always looking at the other. And if you really take to heart the Hasidic story and the Hasidic taich on Matovu Alecha, that in and of itself, that one little lesson and it's a little lesson, but it's a powerful lesson, can change the very nature of relationships.
So a lot of people on this Zoom and on Facebook read those stories, but I'm more than happy to repeat it.
Always worth repeating. Chazorah, chazorah,
Yes,
chazorah.
yes. So it was a pivotal moment when I studied this, where it really awakened my understanding of how to really use this as a key foundation as a marriage and family counselor. And I'm going to take us all back to the time when the Jewish people were in the desert, leaving Egypt and on their way to the Holy Land. And they were all together encamped and had many tents. And fast forward many years later, Bilam comes and he's hired to curse the Jewish people, and God doesn't let him, and instead a blessing came out. And what was this curse that ended up being a blessing was Bilam referring to the powerhouse people, and the key point of their powerhouseness, as it were, was that during the time when they were encamped in the desert and when they had all these tents, none of the doors were aligned one to the other. Why? Because this is how powerfully modest the people are. They were so careful to make sure that no two doors of their tents, doors as it were, why? Because they didn't want to peer into the other person's tent. And symbolically that means not only, oh my goodness, I don't want to by accident see an immodest scene in the other tent or a woman not covered properly, but me and you and each person at that core essence have the power. That's our blessing. That's our gift. That's our in our DNA of our soul, not to constantly look at someone else's faults. That I'm going to be modest and look only at myself and what I need to fix about myself. And I'm going to train myself not to look at the other and their weaknesses. So years later, thousands of years later, there's a story whereby this prisoner who was in prison because he was teaching Torah happened to see a very interesting scene. That somehow the inmates were playing cards, and while they were playing cards, the guards got a glimpse of it. It was a strange scene because everything is confiscated. How do they get the chance to play with these cards? But the guards came in, and as soon as they started trying to get the cards back, they disappeared. And then the guards would leave, and again, the cards would appear. So Mendel Futerfas thought maybe they do witchcraft or something. Maybe they're magicians. So the guards came back in, again, no cards. And the guards eventually gave up. So Mendel Futerfas wanted to see, how are they doing this? He was there, he saw there was no place to hide these cards. So the inmates, the ones that were playing the cards, were actually thieves. And they said, we have quick hands. Every time the guards came in, we put the cards in the guards' pockets. And every time the guards would leave, we snatched the cards out of their pockets. They never even thought to look in their own pockets. So when Mendel Futerfas heard this, he said, that's such a lesson in life. Everybody's always looking elsewhere. Why aren't you this? And how come you didn't do that? And picking and fault finding. But if they would only look at their own pockets and they only would see how difficult from a gut level it is to fix oneself, then they wouldn't take it so personally. Then they wouldn't be as irritated. Then they wouldn't be as triggered by the other. Because it's not because they don't love you, it's because it's hard to change. Habits are hard to break. As much as it is for you to break certain habits, it's also for them. And so if you could Remind yourself every day when you say this prayer, Ma tovu olecha Yaakov. Why? Because we're reminded, remember, your DNA of your soul has the power to be modest, has the power not to look into someone else's tent. And that's why if you notice in the Arizal Siddur, it says, Hareini mekabel alai mitzvahs aseh shel v'ahavta recha kamocha. Right before this prayer. Why? Because the only way you're going to have real love for another is if you don't look into their faults. If you train yourself to just look into your own faults and what you can do to better yourself for a better relationship. And that's like really the main point of that prayer.
Right, and it was driven home to me when my son was a teenager, and I was always finding faults. And I remember my wife telling me, in addition to, give him more love than criticism. But the time that it was really
more love than
criticism.
Yes, I just had to make that sure.
Was what really drove it home to me was when she would say to me, okay, so he doesn't seem to improve or change in this area that you want. What about this area that you've told me for the last 7 years that you're going to fix? A small area, whether it was, whatever it was. Brushing your teeth better. I don't know what it was, but every year.
Never said that.
Never said it was. But every year, I didn't want to identify a true fault of mine.
I see.
But every year, saying to her the same thing. God, I really want to work on this. I don't know why it's so hard for me. And if you recognize that aspect of the human condition, that sometimes what you think is a simple matter to correct, why can't my son just do this one thing, or why can't my wife just do this one thing, or my husband just this one thing, or my boss just this one? What's so hard about it? Think about all the little things that you can't fix in yourself, seemingly. They're so difficult for you that every year you make another hachot, another decision. Now I'm going to fix it. Now I'm going to lose that weight. Now I'm going to start exercise. Now I'm going to start learning Torah. Now I'm going to do chitas. Whatever it may be. And how many times you've made the hachota and then 6 months later there's no evidence of it. God forbid. So that's what these two, the Hasidic story and the Taich on Matovu Olecha, really come to teach us. That, the Meforshim, when they looked at Matovu, the idea of not looking into the other tent was all about physical modesty. And Hasidus came to say, that's true. Jews are modest people innately. Sometimes it's not easy to recognize that innate quality, but it's true. But what this really teaches us is not that they didn't look at the other individual at the physical level, they didn't look at them at the emotional level, the spiritual level, the Gashmidik level of saying, look at all their faults. They turned away from that to focus on their own tent. And the same story of Reb Mendel Fudafas, that these pickpockets, the guards never could imagine that the evil was in their own pockets. And that's what struck Reb Mendel as a lesson. And it is a very, very powerful one. And I'm going to kind of come to a conclusion for this podcast on an idea that comes both in connection with what we've been talking about in terms of relationships and how to make it work, the idea of bittul, of self-abnegation, and then this idea of not being so quick to look at your other's faults.
Because that's humbling.
Pardon me?
That is humbling, because when you realize that it's not about them and what they're doing wrong, because you realize you also have the things that is hard for you to fix. So then, I remember this one woman who came to me and said, fix my son, kind of like almost take the watch and bring it to a repairman. I'm like, first of all, I'm not going to fix, because first of all, the first thing is I'm going to help you come to terms with the process of the development stages of children. You know, and then like 2 days later, I happened to see her somewhere, you know, and she was yelling at her child and not manifesting the things that she wanted to change her son with. And I said, like, you can't even manage and self-regulate. How are you expecting a little child with a small brain to do what you can't even do? That's the point. Like, that's so humbling when you realize you can't even fix yourself. Then how almost dare one have that double standard that the other person has to have such a fixed personality?
Right. So now keep in mind what my wife just said, because that's powerful. Remember the divine flow. It flows down through the husband, into the wife, the children, then back up in reverse order. So the bittul, the self-abnegation, has to be inverted. The man has to ultimately be bittul to his wife to receive the flow that came up through the children. And whether it's the physical children or the spiritual children, and whether it's through the wife or within his individual alone, one can start with the idea that in order not to look at the other and see their faults, I need to mivatel, I need to bittul myself. And so that's one direction. That's the flow. The first part of that flow from Keser through Koach Ma. I bittul myself, I become Koach Ma, that potential of what? Koach, potential Ma, what? Which is symbolized by the Yud, just a dot with a little coat, a little thorn on top and a little thorn on bottom, receives flow from on top, hits that dot, which is nothing, and then flows down. So you can bittul yourself, you can work on yourself spiritually, and that will allow you the ability, once it flows into your bina, your understanding, your maternal, your ima side, your mother side, your female side, to analyze it and develop it and understand, I shouldn't be looking at my wife's or my husband's fault. I need to really focus on my own, recognizing I've got plenty to work on. But what my wife is saying is fascinatingly true. It can work in the other direction. And this is the reverse for the or choser, that if I can appreciate intellectually, right, even a child can understand this, so it can flow through the children and through the bina, the female side. I can understand intellectually that I have lots of faults. And so if I'm always busy judging others for their faults, then goodness gracious, shouldn't I at least look in the mirror first and not only judge my faults, but fix them before I demand of others to fix theirs? Shouldn't I at least start there? That's a process of bittul, so that the bittul can flow back the other way. And that's what we talked about in the first podcast. The divine flow, one of the wonderful truths and the beauty of the Hasidic concepts of the divine flow is that there is always haloch v'shov, there's always a give and take, there's always a cycle, there's always a inverse process. So we say that kol yurida v'tzorach aliyah, every going down is for the betterment, meaning you actually get better as a result of falling down or failing, God forbid. And that same thing holds true with this concept of bittul. You don't have to necessarily start with the idea, I'm going to become bittul to the Eibishter, and then my wife can do this, and kids can do that, and then the folk. You can start with the very simple, common sense understanding that if you were to sit down and list all of your faults, all of the physical and spiritual shortcomings you have, and decide what is the priority that I should begin to work on them, and then measure your progress as we do in the professional world. Set goals, set dates that you want to achieve something, set sub-goals how to achieve that, measure it at every level, and see how you're doing. What you're going to find is that with all of your efforts, you're going to have success and you're not going to have success. And if that's true of you, Al achat kama v'kama, a fortiori, even more so for the people that you love. Shouldn't you have at least as much patience for them as you have for yourself? I dare say more, but at least as much. And so that process of bittul can work both ways.
And that's why, back to the Haftorah, Hashem says, I don't need your house. I don't need, the earth is my footstool. And all these things actually represent Torah and mitzvahs. And he says, I don't need your house, meaning the Torah studies and the heavens and all your mitzvahs. I just want you to get to this level of being like the moon. And the moon, as it's getting smaller and smaller, then becomes greater and greater. Sorry. And that's like the whole point of Torah mitzvahs, is to reach that level of humbleness, and also in marriage.
So I'll leave you with this, which is a taste of maybe the next podcast. We'll get into this at a deeper level. There are different levels at which a person experiences existence. So there's the level of experience, existential existence, which is just a fancy word for physical existence. And the way that an individual experiences physical existence is through the five senses, right? Sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. And that existential experience then allows someone to utilize his physical intellect, the Gashmidik intellect, the seichel of the behema in our Lashon, in our language, the animal soul, to understand the world around them. In common parlance, in a secular parlance, it is the world of science. Science simply measures physical things. And then you can have scientific consensus about what those measurements mean, but that's all it can do. All science can do, all intellectual knowledge of the physical world can tell us, is how tall, wide, skinny things are, how many there are, how much they weigh, and then try to speculate about what that means in the physical world. What the physical senses, that existential existence, cannot do is it cannot tell us about spiritual truth. My son found a fascinating clip from the Rebbe on a teaching that certainly my children and my wife have heard at our Shabbos Tish from me for years, that I learned from my political mentor, Professor Lowenberg, God rest his soul. And that is that science and math is simply about measuring physical things. Nothing more. It's why science can't tell us anything about spiritual truths. To understand spiritual truths, one has to tap into their spiritual faculties of emunah. It's a sense like the five senses, but it emanates from the soul. And you know it exists because you know you exist. You experience the present tense. And science and the physical intellect can never measure the present tense. It's a problem in even science philosophy classes. The conscious eye. That science, once you try to measure something, the moment of measuring, the understanding of its length, its width, its height, its quantity, it's a past tense. It already was. You can't measure it, you can't even speak about it, you can't even think about it. The moment you're thinking about it, it already was. might be a nanosecond before, but it was. But yet, we know we exist, and that's why we have the bracha in Yotzer. That the Eibishter is mechadesh, the world, kol rega v'rega. He's every moment of the present tense is an entirely new spiritual existence. And you know it is because you experience it. I know I'm here. I'm sitting with my wonderful wife. I'm having a podcast. Now, the moment you look at it, whether it's later today or tomorrow, or the moment I think about it, it was. But the moment it's happening, I can experience it. I can close my eyes and know I'm experiencing it. That's where the famous expression, stop and smell the roses, comes from. Right? You got to stop long enough and smell the roses. It doesn't say see the roses or touch them. It means to experience them at a level of smell, reach, which is something that surrounds you and permeates you. You just experience it. You don't see it, but you know it's there. And the Rebbe's video, a shliach apparently had brought some gevir, and the Rebbe had given this gevir $1 or some coinage, and the shliach was bent over, and the Rebbe was at a farbrengen, and the Rebbe pointed out to the shliach, pay attention to what's on the dollar. It says, "In God we trust." And I think the shliach might have said something to the effect, well, belief in God is important. He believes in God. And the Rebbe said, no. Not belief. Belief is meaningless. You can believe something and act an entirely different way. You can believe in the tooth fairy. You can believe in all sorts of things 1 minute and then not believe it the next, because belief is meaningless. When we translate the famous expression, it's in a prayer, it's in Yigdal, it's in Adon Olam, it's in the Yud Gimel Karim, the 13 Principles of Faith. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I believe with perfect faith, and whatever. There's 13 of these, and of course it ends with the ultimate redemption, Tchias HaMesim. But that is a terrible translation. Ani ma'amin be'emunah. The word ma'amin is the same shorish, aleph mem nun, as be'emunah, faith, and as amen. And as we learn from Rashi and from the Rebbe and Chassidus, amen means it's a confirmation of truth, confirmed. And it can be said at the end of a bracha, it can be said as a matter of a shavua, an oath. And that's what ani ma'amin, we translate it, I believe with perfect faith, but the proper translation is, I experience in faith, with perfect faith, be'emunah shlema, and complete faith, in God, in God's redeeming us, in Tchias HaMesim, in Lasad Lavo, in Mashiach. And that is not belief. Belief is meaningless. I could care less what anybody believes. When someone says, I believe in God, it's meaningless to me, because tomorrow they may not believe in it, or they might think they believe in it, but act in a completely different way. The Rebbe's point on the dollar goes even higher. It's not just emunah. It's bitochon. In God we trust. And bitochon is emunah, as it were, on steroids. It's not just accepting the fact that God runs the world. It's understanding that our very existence at every single moment in time is an ultimate godly goodness, and that we interact with that godly goodness with our bitochon. And that's a complicated subject which we won't get into now, because it does relate to this idea in a relationship, and I would suggest as follows: that at any moment in time, you have doubts about your relationship and about what you've heard from this young lady to my left and what's in her books and what makes a relationship and marriage and parentage, children and so forth, what makes them work. If you have those doubts, tap into something different than your own physical, intellectual understanding of the world or your existential experience of the world, your physical history. Open yourself up to the emunah and the bitachon and simply close your eyes and experience that and apply that moment to moment to get to the point where the simple lessons about not being so quick to judge someone else and really look at yourself carefully and work on your own shortcomings, that will make that process, I think, infinitely easier.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well said, everything. Wow, it's been a beautiful hour. And yes, today we did it on a Thursday. You know, sometimes you have to go with the flow. But please God, every Tuesday, 12 o'clock, that's our goal, to continue these marriage dialogues. And so happy that you get to meet my partner in life and that we're partnering this.
And next week I'll be out of town.
Oh, you are? So you can be on the podcast over there? Like, you can go through the Zoom if
we
you
could
want.
do that. Yeah, we could try. I'd have to take the camera with me, but yeah.
Okay. No, you could do it on the phone. I do Zoom on the phone all the time.
Okay. I don't. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well, okay, we'll figure out the technicals. Blessings for a beautiful week, and Bezrat Hashem, meet up next Tuesday.
Zagazan, Mashiach now.
Oh, wow. Bye-bye. Oh, see you later. Any questions? Oh my, I always forget to do that, and you already... Okay, let me see if there's any questions here.
We'll pick those up next week.
Okay, then we'll look at the questions, and next week we'll see what we can answer. Thank you for joining us.